Welcome to this exploration of one of Appalachia's most unsettling cases. Please let me know in the comments where you are currently viewing this video before we start. We'll explore the shadows of the North Carolina mountains today, when the nation was ripped apart by the state-to-state war, and some families had secrets as dark as the foggy valleys that surrounded their remote cabins. It is 1863. The nation had been devastated by the Civil War for 2 years, although bloody. While conflicts raged on far-off fields in North Carolina's Appalachian mountains, a parallel reality was emerging. Whole families lived in near total isolation there, far from the designated battlefields. Western North Carolina has always been a place of tough people, cut off from the outside world by deep forests, steep canyons, and a long-standing mistrust of any outside authority. Deep valleys were formed by the Blue Ridge Mountains rising like natural walls, allowing entire communities to go months without speaking to the outside world. The world. In particular, Madison County was renowned for its perilous trails and the unbreakable character of its residents. Many men from that area refused to fight for either side when the war started because they saw it as a battle between rich farmers, distant politicians, and plainsmen. However, the newspapers of the day hardly dared to mention something else that existed in those mountains. One family in particular started to draw suspicious looks from the few families living in Madison County's more isolated areas, travelers who went over that territory. There were no official records containing their last name. Their group of cabins stood close to the junction of two streams before they descended the mountain, and they were referred to as the family at the fork in the river. The earliest stories of this family surfaced in bits and pieces, with a peddler on the mule trails between small towns mentioning in a Marshall, the county seat, tavern that he had passed close to the property and sensed something was not quite right. He couldn't quite put it into words. Maybe it was the quiet. There was only smoke rising from a chimney and dark curtains covering the windows even in the middle of the day. There were no dogs barking, chickens scratching, or the sound of an axe cutting wood. A different traveler, a traveling preacher who spread the gospel to remote areas, claimed to have attempted to visit the family in order to provide spiritual support. 2 stern-looking men carrying long rifles met him at the trailside. They informed him that they didn't require any sermons and that he should get over it. Something strange caught the preacher's attention behind the men. There was movement among the trees farther back. The shadows moved swiftly, as though someone was being concealed. The scene stuck in his memory, even though he didn't insist and left. Stories started to proliferate during that winter of 1863. One hunter claimed to have heard screams from that direction at night, screams that sounded nothing like any animal he was familiar with. When he brought this up to others, he was met with awkward silences and low looks from the locals. Everyone seemed to know something, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it. Everything became more complicated because of the war. With men being drafted or escaping to the mountains to avoid serving in any branch of the military, county officials were in a state of confusion. The sheriff of Madison had resigned, and his successor was a youthful, inexperienced man who could hardly keep the peace in the county seat, much less look into hazy rumors about a family secluded in a isolated valley. However, something happened in the spring of that year that made it impossible to ignore. A trader who was carrying goods to sell in the villages while traveling from Tennessee to North Carolina just vanished. He would have passed right through the area where the River Fork family resided if he had followed his known route. He never made it to his destination. 3 weeks later, his mule still saddled but unladen was discovered wandering by itself close to Marshall. In a desperate attempt to get information, the merchant's family offered a reward. This drew a few men were eager to look into it. An elderly Cherokee tracker who was familiar with every trail in those mountains joined the small group of 5. Following the merchant's path, they set out and questioned everyone they came across. They eventually reached the estate of the enigmatic family in this manner. There, they would discover a truth far more sinister than anyone could have ever dreamed. It was a gray April morning when the search party reached the river fork. Among the pines and oaks, the fog was still low, establishing a thick atmosphere that seemed to engulf all noise. The first person to notice something odd was Thomas Crow, a Cherokee tracker. He gestured to the area close to the main trail. Though they didn't follow the typical traveler pattern, there were recent signs of passage. The tracks were disorganized, as though someone had been carried or dragged. The cabin was obscured by a thicket of vegetation and was roughly 300 meters from the trail. They were 3 shoddy wooden buildings constructed haphazardly and without the attention to detail that typically showed up even the poorest families in the area. The property was surrounded by dark buildings and the thin smoke rising from one of the chimneys, but there was no fence, no visible orchard, and no structured vegetable garden. William Garrett, a veteran of the local militias who led the group, yelled his presence. In the mountains, it was customary. Nobody dared to approach a property without warning or run the risk of being shot. Nothing happened for a few minutes, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the river in the distance. Garrett yelled once more, stating that they were looking for a merchant who had gone missing. At that moment, the central hut's door slowly opened. A tall, incredibly thin man with a long, disheveled beard emerged. He carried a rifle with the carelessness of someone who never lets go, and his eyes were small and deeply set. 2 other men, equally armed, emerged behind him. They all took up positions in front of the door, obstructing the view of the inside. Garrett described the circumstances. The merchant was no longer there. They just wanted to know if anyone had seen anything along his last known route, which went through that area. For what seemed like an eternity, the tall man remained silent. Then he said in a low, hoarse voice that they had not seen any traders, that they lived by hunting and gathering, that they hardly ever went down to the main trail, and that they had no interactions with travelers. The tracker, Thomas Crow, moved a few paces aside in an attempt to get a better view of the vicinity of the cabins. At that moment, he became aware of something unsettling. A pile of recently turned earth stood close to the smallest of the 3 buildings. It appeared to be brand new, maybe just a few days old. It was clearly rectangular, but not large enough to be a vegetable garden. It was immediately apparent to his seasoned eye. It was as large as a grave. The tall man's expression changed as soon as he realized he was paying attention. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Fingers reaching for the triggers, the 3 armed men shifted their positions. Sensing danger, Garrett promptly thanked them for the information and motioned for his group to flee. They were aware of their overwhelming numerical disadvantage. In that land, those men were familiar with every tree, rock, and escape route. Thomas Crow became agitated as the group withdrew. He shared his observations of the disturbed earth when they were out of earshot. The other witnesses attested to seeing the same thing. In addition, there were other anomalies. One of the men in the group observed that there was no obvious planting, even though it was spring. How did the family make it through? They appeared to have no contact with traders or other settlements, and game was scarce during that season. The quiet was even more unsettling. There were no voices coming from the huts, and no women had shown up. Families with multiple members, including women and the elderly, were typical in even the most remote communities in that area. However, they had only seen those 3 men there, all of whom had the same stern expression and a look that betrayed nothing but animosity. Garrett determined that they had to inform the Marshal Deputy Sheriff about everything. After descending the mountain, the group gave a report to the county seat 2 days later. John Patterson, the sheriff, listened with increasing alarm. He was aware of the rumors and stories that were whispered in churches and taverns about this family. Rumors, however, were a different matter. A potential new grave was, another one entirely. But Patterson was aware of his lack of resources. Nearly every physically fit man had been lost in the war. It would be almost impossible to send an official expedition to this far-flung place with enough troops to handle armed and dangerous men. Moreover, there was no hard proof of any criminal activity. Anything could be a pile of disturbed earth, a concealed bear trap, a supply cache, and a buried pet. However, Patterson was not a fool. He made the decision to communicate with Asheville, a bigger city to the southeast, requesting direction and, if feasible, reinforcements. In the meantime, he gave the order to covertly post lookouts along the trails that lead out of the area. He wanted to know if anyone in that family attempted to flee. We waited tensely for weeks. Asheville took a while to respond, and when it did, the news was not encouraging. In remote areas, there were no men available for investigations. All resources were being consumed by the war. Their best option was to either wait for the conflict to end or until there was additional hard proof of criminal activity. During this waiting period, an unexpected event occurred. At dawn, a woman stumbled down Main Street in Marshall. Her clothes were ripped, her feet were bleeding and bare, and her hair was matted and covering her face. Her condition was appalling. The words that came out of her mouth when they eventually got her to talk would chill everyone who heard them. She had gotten away from the river's fork. The woman was instantly transported to the residence of Henry Whitmore, an elderly physician who was one of the few practicing physicians in the county at the time of the war. She was in critical condition. Her feet were obviously injured, and she had multiple marks on her body that indicated long-term abuse and evidence of severe malnutrition. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and she looked terrifiedly at every window and door, as though something horrible might suddenly appear. Sheriff Patterson was contacted right away. The woman was in a state of shock when he got there, alternating between long silences and unintelligible mumbling. Dr. Whitmore clarified that she needed time to heal and that speaking right now might make her condition worse. However, Patterson was aware of his lack of time. They had to move fast if this woman was indeed from the estate of the enigmatic family. Patterson gently and patiently persuaded her to eat some bread and drink some water. Slowly, the woman started responding to basic inquiries. Sarah Hicks was her name. Her age was 28. While traveling through the area with her husband, she was apprehended nearly 2 years prior. They were attempting to get to Tennessee, where his brother owned land, from eastern North Carolina. They were never successful. Over the course of the following few hours, Sarah told a story that was straight out of a nightmare. She had set up camp close to the main trail by the river fork with her husband, Daniel Hriss. It was late in the afternoon when someone came up to them. Silently, 3 armed men emerged from the trees. Sarah described their expressions as blank, as though they were staring through people instead of at them. There was only quick and effective violence, no warning or negotiation. First to be subdued was Daniel. Before he could react, a blow to the head knocked him down as he reached for his gun. The forest was their domain, despite Sarah's attempts to flee. Just a few meters away, she was taken prisoner. They restrained both of them and hauled them to the cabins at the top of the mountain. As she was dragged across the uneven forest floor, Sarah recalled the sensation of branches scraping her skin. They were split up when they arrived at the cabins. They led Daniel to one of the smaller buildings. Sarah was cast into a cellar that had been excavated beneath the main cabin. She found she wasn't alone there in the near darkness. Others existed. She could see at least 3 figures huddled in the corners of that renowned hole in the dim light. Among, there was an elderly woman who explained that she had been there for more than a year in a shaky voice. Thinking she was on unclaimed land, she had been apprehended while looking for medicinal herbs in the forest. Another was an unaccompanied young man who erred by requesting water on the premises. The third was a boy whose condition was too upsetting for Sarah to go into detail about. Sarah told the sheriff that there were 5 men in the family that owned the place. She could never be sure, but they all seemed to be closely related. They didn't talk to each other very often, and when they did, it was in an unfamiliar language that was a combination of Appalachian dialect and something older. They led a predatory lifestyle, occasionally capturing travelers and imprisoning some for varying periods of time. It was all the more sinister because of the reason behind these captures. The inmates were made to labor. Deep within the forest was an illicit distillery operation that produced raw whiskey, which they subsequently resold in far-off cities via intermediaries. However, work wasn't everything. The family used the inmates in unsettling experiments on human resistance to fear and deprivation, keeping them in a state of psychological terror all the time. According to Sarah, they were kept in appalling conditions, fed barely enough to stay alive, and periodically removed from the basement to perform a variety of horrifying and varied tasks. She steered clear of specifics, but her expressionless gaze while speaking said far more than her words. At one point, Dr. Whitmore, who was there for the testimony, had to leave the room because he was feeling so sick from what he was hearing. After Daniel, Sarah's husband, was captured, she saw him just once. It was roughly half a year ago. He had become completely obedient, his eyes dead, and he was no longer recognizable. He was constantly watched while working in the distillery. Other inmates told Sarah that Daniel had made 2 attempts to flee. The second time, he received a punishment that set an example for everyone else. She made it apparent that her husband had most likely not survived, but she did not elaborate. Sarah's escape was entirely coincidental. After a night of overindulging in their own whiskey, one of the family members, possibly the most reckless or arrogant, left the basement door loosely locked. Sarah saw her opportunity after spending months examining every routine, pattern, and flaw in this system of captivity. She waited until daybreak, when she was certain that everyone forced the door open while he was asleep. She ran away through the forest without knowing where she was going. She injured herself on rocks and branches after falling multiple times, but fear kept her going. Hours, maybe all night, she ran. She recognized a trail from 2 years ago when the sun came up. Like a ghost from the mountains, she followed it to Marshall and entered the town. What Sheriff Patterson needed was now in his possession. Straightforward, in-depth, and absolutely horrifying testimony. No longer ambiguous rumors or baseless suspicions. This was hard proof that major crimes were occurring in those mountains. He had to move quickly before the family found out about Sarah's escape, destroyed any evidence, or worse, killed the other inmates and vanished into the Appalachians. Patterson was aware of the challenging situation he was in. It would be very challenging to gather enough men for an operation of this size, even with Sarah Hricka's testimony. The conflict had removed the county's most competent residents. The remaining people were either deserters who were hiding in the mountains themselves and would never answer an official call, or elderly farmers who were unable to leave their land. However, there was another option. There was a group of men Patterson knew who worked in the shadows of that area. They were seasoned hunters, veterans of long-standing territorial conflicts, and some former soldiers who had returned from battle injured or demoralized. Although they weren't strictly law enforcement, they were more familiar with those mountains than anyone else, and they didn't hesitate to take risks. To reach them, the sheriff dispatched covert messengers. 12 men assembled in Marshall within 2 days. William Garrett, the leader of the initial search operation, was one of them. Thomas Crow, the Cherokee tracker, was also present. His expertise would be crucial in negotiating the challenging terrain and spotting possible traps. James McCoy, a former bear hunter who was familiar with all the valleys and ridges in the area, was also present. And Benjamin Walters, a reserved individual renowned for his bravery and proficiency with a weapon. After gathering the group, Patterson told them all that Sarah had disclosed. He clarified that the goal was not only to catch criminals, but also to save anyone who might still be alive there. There was not much time. The River Fork family could destroy witnesses and evidence if they found out Sarah had escaped and gotten to the authorities, or they could just vanish into the vastness of. Even the best trackers were unable to locate them in the Appalachian Mountains. The strategy was well thought out. They couldn't just march to the property along the main trail. Long before they were close, they would be discovered. Instead of climbing through the valley, Thomas Crow proposed a longer and more challenging route that would lead them to the property from an unexpected angle descending from a high ridge. Although the 2-day hike would be through difficult terrain, it would improve their chances of attaining the surprise element. Armed with weapons, ropes, provisions, and the grim determination of someone who knows they might not return, they set out before dawn on the 3rd day. While still recuperating under Dr. Whitmore's care, Sarah Harris insisted on creating a crude map of the cabin layout and the cellar where she had been detained. She drew with trembling hands, but the map would come in very handy. It was a difficult trip through the mountains. On the sides, they ascended paths that looked like scars of the ridges. Even though the cold persisted at such heights, they slept outside and crossed icy streams where the water reached their waists. Thomas Crow led them with remarkable accuracy, changing their course as he deciphered clues in the rocks and vegetation that other men would have taken for granted. The group fell silent on the 2nd day as they started to descend toward the river fork on the other side. They only used gestures to communicate, each and every. In the deep silence of the forest, the sound of a twig breaking beneath the foot was like a gunshot. Thomas repeatedly halted the group, his keen ear picking up noises that the others missed. He once indicated marks on the trunk of a tree. Deliberate cuts had been made by someone who had just gone by. They served as markers of territory. They started to see more unsettling indicators as they got closer. Bones from unusual game animals were strewn among the trees in an odd, almost ceremonial arrangement. Fragments of an old boot left next to a rock, torn cloth stuck in bushes. These were the ruins of lives that had gone by but never returned. When they saw the first cabin through the trees, Garrett pulled the group to a stop. They were on high ground, roughly 200 meters north of the property and 100 meters above it. They could watch from there without being noticed. They would benefit from the fact that it was late afternoon and the light was starting to fade. They made the decision to postpone their final decision until dusk. Strategy. They saw activity on the property while they waited. 2 men came out of the main cabin and headed toward the river with buckets. Another made a fleeting appearance at one of the smaller building's doors before going back inside. The central chimney was still rising with smoke. Everything appeared ordinary and routine. It might have been just another remote property owned by people who wanted to live far from civilization if they hadn't known what this place was. However, they were aware. And that understanding made every second of awaiting torture. Innocent people were imprisoned and living in unspeakable conditions somewhere in those buildings, perhaps in the basement Sarah had mentioned. For them, each minute that went by meant another minute of agony. Thomas Crow signaled as darkness finally engulfed the mountains. They split up into 3 groups. Garrett would lead the first, which would approach the main cabin from the front. McCoy's second would encircle it from the right. Walters would lead the third, which would come from the left. Patterson would continue to hold the central position with Garrett's group. Before making their presence known, they were to completely encircle the property. They went down the slope very carefully. Before applying any body weight, every movement was tested and every step was calculated. They made it, but it took nearly 30 minutes to cover the distance that would typically be completed in minutes. Without disturbing anyone on the property, they arrived at their assigned positions. That's when Garrett issued the order. His voice cut through the quiet of, like thunder in the night. This property is fenced under Madison County law. Make sure your hands are visible as you exit the buildings. Force will be used to overcome resistance. Nothing happened for a few long seconds. The main cabin door then slowly opened, and none of those men would ever forget what started to happen that evening in the mountains of North Carolina. One of the men Garrett had seen on his first visit was not the figure that came out of the main cabin. It was a different person. Aged and stooped, yet he exuded a commanding presence in the room. His long, white hair fell like a curtain of filthy snow over his shoulders. He didn't appear to be carrying a weapon, but his stance gave the impression that he didn't need one. The old man was standing in the doorway, gazing into the darkness as though he could see every one of the intruders' locations. Then he said, "You have no authority here," in a voice that was surprisingly firm for someone of his appearance. "Leave while you can. These lands have been ours longer than your grandparents have set foot on this continent," Patterson said as he moved forward, still partially hidden by the vegetation. He introduced himself as a sheriff and said that they had seen violent crimes occurring on the property, that people were being detained against their will, and that if they didn't cooperate right away, there would be dire repercussions. After standing still for a moment, the old man uttered what could have been a sigh or a laugh. He turned a little and spoke softly to the cabin's occupants. The other doors opened at that moment. Men started to emerge from the three structures. They were all armed and had the same expressionless look that Sarah had described. The air became almost solid with tension. 5 men are defending the property, while 12 men are encircling it. Although the odds were in Patterson's group's favor, those 5 were obviously willing to use their knowledge of every inch of the terrain, every shadow, and every angle. Weapons. Thomas Crow was the one who ended the impasse. With the insight of someone who had witnessed far too much conflict in his life, he yelled a suggestion that the prisoners be turned over safely and that everyone would escape unharmed, that the conflict didn't have to end in bloodshed, and that laws still had to be followed during times of war. The ensuing silence seemed to go on forever. Suddenly the old man nodded. In his peculiar dialect he spoke to the others. Reluctantly, 2 of them lowered their weapons and made their way to the main hut. They vanished for a short while before coming back. Even the hardest-trained men in Patterson's group instinctively shuddered at what came next. They pushed 3 human figures out of the hut. In their state, they hardly qualify as people. They could hardly stand because they were so weak and weakened from years of abuse and neglect. Their eyes blinked painfully. Their hair was long and matted, and they were dressed in rags. Faint starlight, as though they had been without light for ages. From the sidelines, James McCoy recognized one of the figures right away. It was Joshua Miller, a farmer from Buncombe County, who had vanished the fall before while transporting grain to Marshall for sale. His family had been looking for months without finding anything. He was now a shadow of the person he used to be. With their weapons level and their free hands extended toward the released inmates, Garrett and Patterson moved cautiously forward. The trio stumbled, moving in their direction with the hesitancy of people who weren't sure if this was a cruel illusion or the real thing. They started to sob quietly as they were finally brought to them and escorted behind the lines, as though only then they realized they were actually being saved. Patterson, however, was aware that he was incomplete. When Sarah was in the basement, at least 4 people were mentioned. There had only been 3 introduced. She insisted on knowing the location of the 4th. The old man grinned, his face cold and humble. All he said was that not everyone makes it out alive, that those who are weak die. It's a natural law. The negotiations were ended by that response. Patterson issued directives. The family's 5 men would be taken into custody right away. There would be a thorough search of the entire property. Any opposition would be regarded as an attack on the police. He would not think twice about using force if it became necessary, and he had 12 armed men. What came next was quick. It's possible that the family members recognized their actual disadvantage. Or maybe the old man. There was no armed opposition, but some mental calculations of gains and losses had been made. They were disarmed and bound one by one. The old man was the last, and he continued to display his superiority even with his hands bound, as though this were all a passing annoyance. After securing the 5 men, Patterson's team started looking through the buildings. Reports that were distributed among local authorities in the months that followed would detail what they discovered over the course of the following few hours using a torch and flashlight. Appear, always using cautious, technical language, as though writing with more straightforward language would be too risky. Surprisingly, there were no personal items in the main hut. There were just the bare necessities for survival. There were no books, pictures, or items that suggested a relationship to the outside world or even to a person's past. These people seemed to only exist in that remote location's eternal present. The distillery operations Sarah had described were visible in the second cabin. They were basic but functional. Equipment for making illicit whiskey, barrels in different fermentation stages, and transportable bottles. It was a large operation that undoubtedly produced a lot of resources. They discovered something even more unsettling in the third structure. There were jars filled with different liquids, dried herbs, and handwritten notes in an unintelligible language that combined ancient English with symbols. Additionally, Thomas Crow identified bundles of plants that his people used in ancient rites, but mixed together in ways he didn't understand. Then they discovered the basement. It would have been simple to overlook the entrance, which was so deftly concealed beneath a table in the main cabin. With a lantern in front of him, Benjamin Walters descended first. Several men recoiled at the smell that rose. It was more than moisture and deterioration. It was the stench of long-term human suffering, something more profound and ancient. The room was not as large as Sarah had said, making it even more cramped. The stone walls had chains fastened to them. The walls and floor had scratches on them, which could be day counts or simply the frantic records of minds shattering under the strain. Additionally, there was proof that more people had gone through than had been saved. As Patterson's team methodically cataloged everything they discovered, the night turned into a stressful vigil. William Garrett was in charge of questioning the 3 rescued inmates, but their state was so. They were so weak they could hardly speak in full sentences. The missing farmer, Joshua Miller, appeared to have a disjointed mind, but was in the best physical condition. He avoided making long-term eye contact and spoke incoherently. Robert Hayes, a young man, and Margaret Sullivan, a middle-aged woman, were the other 2 people saved. 8 months prior, Margaret had vanished while visiting family in Tennessee. When Robert, a road construction worker, veered too far from his job, he was apprehended. Group while exploring a creek for fresh water. As though a piece of their souls had been abandoned in that basement, they both had the same faraway gaze. Thomas Crow chose to investigate the property's surroundings while the others searched the buildings. He was more familiar with the forest's cues than anyone else, and he understood that the land told stories just as much as words did. He followed faint paths, nearly undetectable signs of frequent travel, that led farther into the thick forest. 200 yards away from the main cabin, he discovered, there was a small, circular clearing where the vegetation had been purposefully removed, something that chilled his blood. There were 7 distinct-sized mounds of earth in the middle. The earth was compacted into rectangular shapes. There were no crosses or markers. In a forgotten forest in the mountains of North Carolina, there are 7 unmarked graves. Crow went right back and told Patterson what he had found. That information was like a stone in the sheriff's stomach. 7 individuals. 7 people were buried there, and those were the only ones whose lives had ended there, far from their loved ones, far from justice, and far from compassion. In the large area of forest that surrounded that property, how many more could have been disposed of in different ways? Patterson determined that the 5 men who were trapped had to be taken to Marshall right away. If the group remained there for too long, something might go wrong. He didn't have the same ability as the mountains to keep their secrets safe. Wish to give these men a chance to escape, or for any unidentified allies to come forward. They planned the departure before dawn. The 3 men who had been saved were covered with blankets and would be given every support they could get on the way back. Each of the 5 men who were taken prisoner was bound to the others with ropes that hindered their ability to move freely. The old man, whose name had not yet been disclosed, was positioned at the head of the queue. He continued to exude that eerie sense of superiority even when he was restrained. The trip back was tense and slow. They needed to use the main trail to move so many people, especially the rescued men who were barely able to walk, unlike the trip there, where they could use the clandestine and difficult route. Leading the charge, Thomas Crow kept an eye out for potential ambushes. With his gun at the ready, James McCoy led the way. The old man started talking during the walk. This was not a light-hearted discussion. He made these claims as though he were delivering sermons to an unseen audience. He mentioned ancient mountain families who followed laws that were deeper than the plainsmen's scriptures and older than governments. According to him, his family had lived in these areas since before the American Revolution, when settlers and Native Americans were still at odds over the Appalachians. He claimed that his family had developed knowledge passed down through the generations and had learned to survive on their own. Understanding of plants, natural cycles, and how to obtain what they needed from the mountains without ever going down into the valleys where common people spent their brief lives. Sheriffs, judges, and other representatives of what they referred to as the government of the weak were not recognized by them as having authority. Patterson told him to stop talking, but he persisted. He claimed that the world was changing, that the conflict between the North and South was only the start of something greater, that families like his would always exist in the background, and that mountains would always endure human foolishness. Maintaining traditional lifestyles despite criticism from the rest of the world. The conviction with which he spoke had a profoundly unsettling quality. It wasn't the words of a crazy person or someone who wasn't grounded in reality. It was the words of someone who sincerely held to a different, albeit sinister and harsh, philosophy of life. He did not consider it a crime to apprehend and imprison travelers. It was a test of dominance over territory, the application of the law of the fittest in its most dreadful and pure form. On the 3rd day of their trip, a small group of people were already waiting for them when they arrived in Marshall. In small towns, news spreads quickly, and word of the mountain operation had gotten out. People flocked to the streets, hoping to see the men who had turned a portion of Appalachia into their own terror zone. Dr. Whitmore was ready to take the 3 men who had been saved. Sarah Hricks waited tensely on the porch, still recovering but already feeling better. of the residence where she was lodging. She started crying when she noticed Margaret Sullivan among the men who had been saved. For months, they had spent time together in that dimly lit basement, helping one another through their darkest hours. Margaret's release served as proof that she had actually managed to get away and that it wasn't a dream. The five were taken to Marshall's makeshift jail, a wooden, reinforced building that is typically reserved for minor offenders and drunks. Patterson was aware that it wouldn't be sufficient to retain them for a long time. He required actual reinforcements, a suitable prison, and a legal system that could deal with such serious crimes. He sent urgent messages to any authority with resources and jurisdiction in Asheville to gather. It was more than rumors and suspicions this time. 5 men were taken into custody, 3 victims were saved, 7 graves were found, and tangible proof of criminal activity was found. It was impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, Patterson worked while he awaited a response from higher authorities. Joshua Miller, who was slowly regaining his ability to speak, worked tirelessly to record statements and disclosed unsettling information about his captivity. He talked about being made to labor in the distillery, about the odd ingredients that were occasionally added to the whiskey, and about witnessing other inmates perish when they were unable to work. Margaret Sullivan added details and reaffirmed everything Sarah had said. She said the family had odd customs, particularly around full moons, and that the old man, whom others referred to as the only patriarch, performed rituals utilizing the herbs and liquids discovered in the 3rd cabin, which they thought connected them to ancient mountain spirits that allegedly gave them authority over the land and anyone who entered it. The youngest person saved, Robert Hayes, found it difficult to describe his experience. When he eventually did, he disclosed that he had seen the fate of Thomas Bedford, the 4th person in the basement when Sarah fled, who had become seriously ill. His family dragged his body to the wooded clearing after merely leaving him to die. Another life lost to memory and record, he was laid to rest in one of those unmarked graves, a picture of an operation that had been carried out in the shadows for years, possibly decades, supported by geographical isolation and the indifference of a world preoccupied with war, was painted by the revelations that kept coming, each one darker than the one before it. After 10 agonizing days of waiting, the higher authorities finally responded. A judge on the road, named Nathaniel Cross, arrived in Marshall with orders to carry out official investigations and set up the scene for a trial, accompanied by 6 Confederate soldiers who had been released from service due to injuries. Cross, a man who had been a magistrate in different parts of North Carolina prior to the war, was renowned for his fair but severe manner. Judge Cross's normally calm expression changed to one that was almost shocked as he heard the first reports and reviewed the evidence. He had performed. He had been on the bench for 23 years, handling murders, robberies, and every other kind of crime he could think of, but he had never seen anything so methodical, so protracted, and so completely without regret as what this family had done. Cross gave the order to send an expedition back to the River Fork property right away. This time, for a different reason. The graves discovered by Thomas Crow had to be exhumed. They required identifications, forensic evidence, and anything that would link those remains to the missing individuals. Throughout the years. Although it was gory work, it was essential to establishing a strong case in court. This return was led by Patterson and included 8 men, including some who had been involved in the initial operation, as well as Dr. Whitmore, who would act as a temporary medical examiner. It felt different now, the drive to the property. Under the gray Appalachian sky, the once dangerous location was now deserted, reduced to a collection of deteriorating wooden buildings. It took 3 full days to clear the graves. Every exhumation was conducted carefully, recording the remains' depth, location, and any items discovered with them. Despite his advanced age and the terrifying nature of the task, Dr. Whitmore worked with remarkable professionalism. He took thorough notes on every body, noting physical traits that might help with identification, potential causes, and the amount of time since death. They were able to determine the likely identities of 5 out of the 7 graves. A wedding ring with engraved initials that matched a merchant's was found on one of the bodies, who had vanished 2 years prior. Another had a religious medal that an Asheville family identified as their son's. Given the size of the bones and the clothing remnants, a third body fit the description of a teacher who vanished while en route to a rural school to accept a job offer. The identities of the other 2 were still unknown. They had nothing to tie them to past lives, no personal belongings. They were merely the names and remains of people who had disappeared so thoroughly that their absences had not even been appropriately documented. Maybe they were traveling alone. Maybe runaways from the actual war. Maybe they were just lost souls that no one had noticed. Judge Cross started the preliminary hearings in Marshall during this period. One by one, the 5 men who had been apprehended were brought in for official interrogation. There were 4 of them who said nothing at all. Their expression remained blank, as it had been since they were apprehended, as they gazed at the judge, as though they didn't care about it at all. The only one who consented to speak was the patriarch, the elderly man who appeared to be the head of the household, but he did not defend or explain himself. Rather, he continued to make claims regarding territorial rights and ancient laws during the hearing. He claimed that through agreements with powers that the judge and his kind would not comprehend, his family had established dominion over this mountainous area, that visitors to their countries implicitly assumed the risks, just as anyone entering. The danger is accepted by the predatory territory. Cross made an effort to guide him with straightforward inquiries. Over the years, how many people had they taken prisoner? "I don't keep count," the patriarch said with a smile. Time in the valleys, where seasons and years go by like days, is different from time in the mountains. Why did they not just release the prisoners? Since he claimed that each of them had a purpose, some for work, some for observation, and some for reasons he didn't specify but hinted at in a extremely unsettling manner. The judge asked about the substances found in the third hut, about the rituals the witnesses mentioned. In response, the patriarch said that his family had preserved knowledge that had been passed down through the generations, combining the knowledge of the original settlers with their own discoveries from decades of isolation, as well as practices learned from native peoples. They used these substances for various purposes, some medicinal, others to alter states of consciousness, and others he declined to elaborate on. There was something particularly unsettling about the way he spoke. He showed no regret, but neither did he display any perverse pride. It was as if he were simply describing objective facts about his existence, the way a farmer might describe his routine of planting and harvesting. To him, it was all natural, just how things worked in his private world deep in the Appalachians. Cross realized he was dealing with something beyond ordinary criminals. There was a complete philosophy behind these actions, a worldview completely disconnected from social and legal norms. This made the case even more complex. How could one judge people who operated according to such a radically different value system? The answer, of course, was that the law didn't recognize alternative systems. Crimes were crimes regardless of the perpetrator's philosophy. As the hearings continued, more information poured in from across North Carolina and neighboring states. People who had lost family members over the years, especially in the Appalachian region, began showing up in Marshall, hoping they might finally have answers. One elderly woman traveled 3 days from Southern Virginia searching for her husband, who had disappeared 5 years earlier while transporting animal pelts to sell. A father appeared looking for his adult son, who had gone off to explore hunting opportunities in the mountains and never returned. Brothers searched for sisters. Wives searched for husbands. Children searched for parents. Each story was a fragment of personal tragedy. Each disappearance a hole left in a family that had never been filled. Patterson and Cross worked to cross-reference this information with what they knew about the operation at the River Fork. Some matches were clear, others remained unclear. The problem was that due to the very nature of the region's isolation and the chaos caused by the war, many disappearances had never been properly investigated. People disappeared in the mountains frequently enough that each individual case didn't cause much alarm. But now, seeing all those cases together, a pattern began to emerge. Over the course of at least 10 years, possibly longer, there had been an unusually high rate of disappearances in the region around the river's fork. Not obvious enough to warrant attention when viewed year by year, but undeniable when observed in its entirety. Thomas Crow, using his knowledge of the region and conversations with other members of remaining native communities, brought additional information. There were ancient stories about this family passed down in whispers among the people who inhabited the mountains before European settlers. Stories of a lineage that had intermingled with settlers very early on, adopting some customs, but maintaining older, darker ones. Stories that most dismissed as legends, but which now took on disturbingly real tones. The magnitude of what was being revealed began to weigh heavily on everyone involved in the investigation. This wasn't just an isolated crime or a series of separate incidents. It was a sustained, systematic operation that had operated for years in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, invisible to the outside world until Sarah Hriss managed to escape and bring to light what should have remained hidden forever. The trial was scheduled to begin in early June 1863. Judge Cross decided it would be held in Marshall as transporting the defendants and all witnesses to a larger city would be impractical given the circumstances of the war, a community hall normally used for religious meetings and social events was converted into a temporary courthouse. News of the trial spread through the mountains like wildfire. People traveled from distant counties, some out of morbid curiosity, others seeking answers about their own missing loved ones. Marshall, normally a quiet town with few inhabitants, saw its population temporarily triple. Tents were erected on the outskirts, and families camped wherever they could find space. There was an eerie atmosphere hanging over everything. It wasn't just the anticipation of a trial, but something deeper. People felt they were witnessing something significant, a moment when ancient mountain secrets would finally be exposed to the light of day. Conversations in taverns and around campfires revolved incessantly around the same themes. How many victims were there really? How long had this been going on? Were there other similar families hidden elsewhere in Appalachia? On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People crowded onto the wooden benches, stood on the sides, and peered through the open windows. Judge Cross opened the session with a speech on the importance of order and decorum, reminding everyone that this was a legal proceeding, not a public spectacle, though the line between the two was visibly blurred. The 5 defendants were taken in chains. The patriarch took the lead, maintaining the same straight stance and expressionless demeanor. Silent as ever, the other 4 lined up behind them. While they stood in front of the judge, amazing things happened. The patriarch surveyed the assembled group, a deliberate, slow gaze that swept over each face in the room. That look was devoid of both challenge and fear. It was more akin to curiosity, as though he were examining fascinating specimens. They read the official indictment. 5 men faced charges of forced labor, illegal captivity, kidnapping, and most seriously culpability for the deaths of at least 7 individuals whose remains were discovered on the property. Every charge was described in detail with, when identification was not possible, each victim was described or identified. The 4 younger men said nothing at all when asked how they would plead. This was noted by the judge as a refusal to enter a plea, which is legally equivalent to a denial of guilt. To everyone's surprise, however, the patriarch spoke. He did not state whether he was guilty or not. Rather, he stated that he did not accept the court's authority, and that people who adhered to earlier agreements were exempt from the laws of men. Curious about how justice operated in the valleys, he would take part in the proceedings. Cross adamantly replied that recognition was not required. The law functioned without regard to personal approval. He then moved on to the phase of presenting the evidence. The first witness was Sheriff Patterson, who described the rescue operation and all the early rumors. The judge's clarifying questions were the only interruptions to his nearly 3-hour testimony. The rescued came next. Witnesses. The first was Sarah Harris. She presented her account of the captivity with care, omitting any particularly upsetting details while still being specific enough to demonstrate the seriousness of the crimes. Many of the audience members were crying when she was done. Throughout her testimony, the patriarch watched her with the same look of analytical curiosity, as though he were listening to someone explain a scientific experiment. Joshua Miller, who was still obviously weak but was determined to testify, was the next. He explained his apprehension, the months he was made to labor in the distillery, the appalling conditions in the cellar, and what happened to the other prisoners he had witnessed wallowing. He continued until he finished his entire account, even though his voice broke multiple times. Similar testimonies were provided by Margaret Sullivan and Robert Hayes, who each added details that portrayed the operation in a more somber light. Margaret mentioned in particular the rites she had seen through the cracks in the floorboards of the basement, ceremonies held under full moons, when the patriarch burned herbs to produce oddly colored smoke and spoke in languages she didn't understand. Forensic evidence regarding the remains exuded from the graves was presented by Dr. Whitmore. Although his report was technical, it was obvious what it meant. Before passing away, a number of the victims had experienced severe malnutrition. Some had bone fractures that were healing at different rates, which suggested that they had sustained injuries repeatedly over time. They had all been laid to rest on the ground without any kind of funeral or attention, covered. According to Thomas Crow's testimony, the family actively tracked the movements of visitors in the area, as evidenced by territorial markings discovered throughout the property and signs of systematic surveillance of neighboring trails. These reports were supported by William Garrett and other rescue expedition members who described their findings in the cabins. Evidence included documents that were taken from the property. They included crude records of distillery production that included dates and quantities over a number of years. There were. Additionally, notebooks containing odd notes, recipe mixtures, observations on the effects of various plant combinations, and notations that appeared to track people's traits and behaviors were written in a coded format that made full interpretation challenging. The presentation of the whiskey bottles that had been taken from the distillery was a particularly tense moment. After examining the samples, Dr. Whitmore found that some of them contained substances other than alcohol, traces of compounds derived from, based on the vegetation in the third cabin. Substances that, in his opinion, might affect the mind, changing perception and potentially leading to dependence. This led to a horrifying line of inquiry. How many residents of the towns and cities surrounding the mountains were unintentionally consuming something that changed their minds if this tainted whiskey was being sold through middlemen? How many odd behaviors are there? How many decisions are inexplicable? How many violent or insane episodes could? be linked to this covert drug distribution via the illicit trade. Judge Cross mandated that the YC's distribution network be looked into further. The intermediaries were who? What was the shipping location? Were they merely common illegal traders who had no idea what they were really transporting, or were there conscious complicity? These questions were too significant to overlook, even though they would have far-reaching implications beyond the current trial. Over the course of the 4 full days that the evidence was presented, the 5 defendants mostly showed no emotion. The 4 youngest did not respond to any of the testimony in any way, nor did they ever speak. Occasionally, the patriarch made small gestures of agreement or disagreement, as though he was more concerned with the veracity of the accounts than with their potential legal ramifications. The 4 youngest defendants said nothing when it came time for them to defend themselves, but the patriarch asked to be allowed to speak. Reluctantly, Judge Cross approved it. One of the most bizarre and unsettling parts of the entire court proceeding was what came next. In the utter silence that pervaded the hall, the patriarch slowly rose, his chains clanking. As he stood in front of Judge Cross, all eyes were on him. Despite his advanced age, he maintained an upright posture. Even the most doubtful members of the audience were forced to listen when he spoke because of the inherent authority in his voice. He told a story to start. He claimed that his family had reached the northern mountains, Carolina, prior to the colony's independence. They were the offspring of European colonists who left coastal settlements in search of total seclusion. They came across traces of indigenous peoples in the mountains who also subsisted on the main routes, and these groups shared knowledge over many generations. The patriarch claims that his family came up with their own philosophy of life. They held that people who lived in mountains were sentient beings with sentience, and that they gave them special rights and treated them with respect. These included the right to dominion over their designated territories, the right to extract resources, and the invisible rites of passage. These agreements were made through experience and observation, rather than written laws. Travelers put themselves in danger by entering these territories without authorization, failing to comprehend the agreements, and showing no regard for the ancient powers. He claimed that the family did not actively pursue them. However, when they implicitly accepted the consequences when they crossed some invisible boundaries and entered areas marked by signs that were only known to the initiated. In his opinion, it was no more than someone who gets attacked when they enter a wild animal's territory. Many in the audience were horrified and perplexed by the patriarch's explanation regarding prisoners and forced labor. He claimed that those who were apprehended were given a chance. They could decide to adjust, pick up their family's customs, and support the remote community they had established. He claimed that some people eventually came to terms with this integration. Others chose to resist and linger rather than accept the new reality. Judge Cross repeatedly interrupted, emphasizing that none of this was a legitimate defense, that keeping someone against their will was illegal under all legal interpretations, that killing someone by carelessness or direct action was murder, and that kidnapping was kidnapping regardless of one's personal beliefs. However, the patriarch went on, describing his worldview as though it were significant to document, without necessarily defending himself in a legal sense. He talked about the preparations and the rituals. According to him, they were instruments for raising awareness and establishing connections with facets of reality that the general public was wholly ignorant of. That, similar to medical or scientific experiments, the sporadic side effects and deaths that happened were a necessary part of the process of discovery, caused fatalities but advanced our understanding. Growing outrage was the audience's response. People started yelling that this was insane and that it was only flimsily masquerading as philosophy. In order to restore order, Judge Cross had to repeatedly bang his gavel and threaten to clear the hall. The patriarch maintained his composure during the chaos, seemingly anticipating this response and viewing it as additional evidence of the basic miscommunication between his world as well as the valley world. After a nearly 2-hour interrupted monologue, the patriarch finally concluded with a statement that would make everyone in the room extremely uncomfortable. He claimed that his family's values would not be abandoned as a result of his arrest and trial, that the mountains were home to others. The authorities could arrest 5 men, but they couldn't arrest entire mountains or patrol every isolated valley, according to other lineages that adhered to similar ideals. Every dense forest had its own systems, maintained by remote families. Judge Cross closed the defense after rejecting these claims as intimidatory. Before the verdict, he made his closing remarks. He reaffirmed that obvious crimes had been committed, regardless of one's own philosophy or beliefs. These men had abducted people, imprisoned them, made them work, and killed a number of them. Numerous testimonies supported the same fundamental facts, and the evidence was overwhelming. Judge Cross's thought process was brief. He called everyone back to the courtroom the following morning and handed down his decision. On every charge, the 5 men were found guilty. Forced labor, multiple kidnappings, illegal captivity, and accountability for the deaths of at least 7 identified victims, with a strong suspicion that the true number of victims was much higher. All 5 were sentenced to severe execution by hanging. Within 2 weeks, it would be completed in Marshall, providing adequate time to make the necessary arrangements and file any appeals. Cross made it apparent that he did not anticipate any appeals being successful due to the circumstances and the strength of the evidence. The community's response to the sentence's news was conflicted. Many believed that justice had been done and that the harshest penalty was appropriate for such serious crimes. But others were uncomfortable, concern over the patriarch's last remarks, rather than necessarily sympathy for the condemned. What if he was? Sheriff Patterson was also concerned. He set up meetings with local authorities from a number of mountain counties in the days after the trial. They talked about the need for more surveillance, improved means of communication between remote communities, and more meticulous documentation of visitors moving through various areas. A lot of people consulted Thomas Crow. His viewpoint was valuable because of his experience and familiarity with the mountains. He acknowledged that there were always rumors about certain families with dubious reputations in the mountain areas that tourists avoided. Most of this was probably just miscommunication or superstition. However, it seemed foolish to automatically reject all the rumors in light of what they had found at the river fork. The 5 condemned men, meanwhile, were held in Marshall County Jail awaiting execution. The youngest 4 remained completely silent, spending their days gazing into space while sitting still in their cells. However, on occasion, the patriarch asked to speak with Judge Cross or Patterson, not to file appeals or make a clemency plea, but to continue sharing bits of information about the mountains, plants, and their uses, and isolated locations where unexplainable events occurred. It seemed as though he wanted to make sure that, upon his passing, at least some of the knowledge his family had amassed over many generations would not be entirely lost. Patterson meticulously documented everything, but he had no idea what to do with it. Some of it was obviously helpful, real information about therapeutic plants or how to navigate challenging terrain. Others were unsettling accounts of macabre and ritualistic practices. While waiting for the case's final verdict in Marshall before heading back to her family in eastern North Carolina, Sarah Harris made one trip to the jail not to see the convicted men, but to make sure they were real, that they were actually imprisoned so they wouldn't be able to harm her once more. Patterson went with her, staying well away from the cells. She gave the patriarch a long look, and he returned the look. Something moved between them in that glance, but no words were spoken. Maybe acknowledgement, or just the end of a horrible chapter. The 2 weeks flew by. With the proper signity, the execution preparations were made. In Marshall's main square, a temporary but sturdy gallows was built, able to accommodate 5 people at once. Many felt compelled to witness the first multiple execution in the county's history, even though nobody wanted to. As though nature itself understood the seriousness of what was about to occur. The day of the execution began with overcast skies and a chilly wind coming down from the mountains. Early in the morning, people started congregating in Marshall's central square. Although there was no celebration, everyone felt compelled to see the resolution. Of that gloomy period, the victims' families were there. Others are just carrying out their obligation to see justice done on behalf of their departed loved ones, while others are looking for some sort of closure. Judge Cross showed up early, his solemn face belying the gravity of his duty. He had never presided over an execution of this size, despite being a fervent advocate of the rule of law and believing that the sentence was just. During their brief conversation, he confirmed with Sheriff Patterson that all legal procedures had been appropriately followed, that no appeals were pending, and that the time had come. The 5 condemned men were taken out of the jail at 10 in the morning. They were escorted by armed soldiers as they marched in a line while wearing chains. The 4 youngest continued to stare straight ahead as if they could see nothing, maintaining the same expressionless demeanor they had throughout the trial. But the patriarch's analytical curiosity had never left him as he surveyed his surroundings. He looked at the throng, the gallows, the gray sky overhead, as though they were learning every detail of their last moments by heart. They were put on the platform for the gallows. A local priest made a last effort to provide religious consolation after offering spiritual services, though he wasn't sure if they would be accepted. None of the 4 young men responded. However, it was the last time the patriarch spoke. He assured the priest that the powers he had made his agreements with would receive forgiveness, and that he didn't require it from a God he didn't know. Him, in accordance with conditions set long before that day. The last sentence was read out loud by Judge Cross, who also confirmed that the execution would take place in the name of justice and the law, and listed the offenses for which these men had been found guilty. Every word he spoke carried the weight of families destroyed and lives lost as it reverberated throughout the quiet square. He gestured to the executioner when he was done. The condemned men's necks were bound with ropes. Their faces were hidden by dark cloth sacks. There was so quiet that it seemed as though the wind had stopped. Then the trap door opened under their feet. It was swift. The bodies hung still, and the crowd remained in respectful silence. No cries of approval or disapproval were heard, just the silent recognition that a horrible event had come to an end, but that its effects would last for a very long time in the mountains. The bodies were not buried in designated graves or in the community. Instead, they were left hanging for the legally required amount of time before being removed and prepared for burial. Cemeteries, but outside Marshall in a different place. The men were to be buried in 5 unmarked graves, which were hoped to be forgotten. Though everyone in attendance was aware that the implications of what had been found would last for years, Judge Cross formally declared the case closed. Since the nation was still at war, Marshall gradually resumed his regular activities in the days that followed the execution. The families who had arrived in search of information regarding their missing loved ones started to depart, some with unpleasant but certain confirmation, others still unsure but at least aware that something had been done. At last, Sarah Hriss left town with an escort who would make sure she returned to her family safely. Robert Hayes, Margaret Sullivan, and Joshua Miller also left gradually, each trying to reconstruct lives that had been brutally interrupted. The healing process would take a long time and probably never end. The wounds from those months spent in captivity would never go away, for all time. Shadows that, even in the brightest light, would never go away. A last visit to the property at the River Fork was led by Thomas Crow and Sheriff Patterson. Devastation was the goal this time. The still was disassembled and its parts scattered, and the 3 cabins were burned to the ground. The cellar was permanently sealed after being filled with rocks and dirt. The graves were left in their original location, with only a quay of piled stones remaining as a silent reminder of the people who had died there. Thomas Crow conducted a private ceremony prior to his permanent departure. In his native tongue, he spoke to the spirits of those who had passed away there, pleading with them to find peace even in the absence of their own people's customs. It was all he had to offer, despite its small size. There was a feeling that this place might finally start to heal when they finished and made their final descent down the mountain. That the river and trees would progressively erase the traces of human presence until nothing remained. Stayed, but told stories in whispers. However, the tales continued. The tale of the Fork River family became a legend in the months and years that followed. In the Appalachian Mountains, parents warned their kids about the perils of traveling through isolated areas by themselves by telling them softer versions. Travelers are now more likely to travel in groups and are more watchful for warning signs. Verification systems were put in place to encourage isolated communities to stay in touch with larger settlements more frequently. Monitor people's whereabouts throughout the area. The patriarch's last remarks regarding other families in the mountains were something Sheriff Patterson would never forget. Over the following few years, he periodically looked into rumors, pursuing shaky leads and attempting to ascertain whether the claims were true or merely the intimidation of a doomed man. Although he occasionally discovered concerning circumstances that needed attention, he never discovered proof of operations like the one at the fork in the river. Dr. Whitmore kept researching the materials taken from the property in an effort to comprehend their makeup and effects. Though he was always cautious to distinguish safe practices from harmful ones, some of his discoveries advanced local medical knowledge about native plants and their uses. His meticulous case files, which historians would discover decades later, were kept in the county archives. Following those events, Thomas Crow lived for an additional 23 years and rose to prominence, figure who upholds mountain law in addition to being a tracker. When odd circumstances emerged in remote areas, authorities regularly consulted him. He consistently underlined that the mountains were big and deep, that they contained mysteries that might never be fully solved, and that the best defenses against the threats that lurked in the shadows were community and vigilance. 2 years after the execution, the Civil War came to an end, bringing with it new difficulties and transformations for North Carolina and the entire South. However, memories of that case persisted in the mountains, where time always seemed to move differently. On local maps, the river fork was marked with ambiguous warnings, making it a place to avoid. With trees growing over the burned foundations and vegetation covering the earth's scars, the forest progressively reclaimed the area. Few people today, over 160 years later, can recall the precise details. Dusty archives contain official documents from a time when the mountains held secrets more sinister than most could envision. Every now and then, local historians or fans of old mysteries come across the case again because they are intrigued by the methodical nature of the crimes and the peculiar ideology that the perpetrators held. The patriarch's queries have never received a satisfactory response. Over the years, how many people have truly vanished from those mountains? How many cases haven't been linked to the family from Fork River? Even more unsettlingly, were there other families in other far-off places that genuinely followed similar guidelines? Sections of the Appalachian Mountains? The wind that blows through the valleys whispers these questions, which linger in the thin air of the highlands. What is certain is that over a long period of time, deep in the North Carolina mountains, a family established their own world apart, ruled by laws that only they understood and maintained by customs that went against all ideas of compassion and humanity. And that upon their eventual discovery and prosecution, they not only exposed specific offenses, but also provided insight into something more general and unsettling regarding the ability of people to establish cruel systems, even in the most remote locations. The rivers and mountains are still there, unaffected by the human tales that have been told along their banks. And occasionally, when hiking alone on isolated Appalachian trails, one may experience that unexplainable uneasiness, that sense of being watched by invisible eyes in the deep forest. Maybe it's just the imagination stoked by old tales, or maybe the mountains actually contain secrets they would rather keep to themselves. Thank you for following this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in Appalachian history, if you have read this far. For more tales of sinister mysteries from the past, think about liking and subscribing to the channel if you liked this content. And let me know in the comments if you think that some isolated locations still keep these secrets until the next.